If an officer turns a simple traffic stop into a fishing expedition, say this to get out. Picture this. You're driving home from work. The lights come on behind you. You pull over. The officer walks up to the window. "Good evening. Do you know why I stopped you?" Maybe you were speeding. Maybe you forgot to signal. Maybe it's a broken taillight. At this point, it's still a normal traffic stop. But then something changes. The officer looks at your license, looks inside the vehicle, and asks a question that has absolutely nothing to do with the reason for the stop. Where are you coming from? That question may seem harmless. Most drivers answer immediately, and that's exactly where the encounter starts to change, because the officer hasn't decided whether the stop ends with a warning, a ticket, or something much longer. The next few seconds matter, and one answer often determines everything that comes next. If knowing your rights matters to you, subscribe now, share this with someone who needs it, and drop your opinion below. Today, we're breaking down the exact decision point that turns a routine stop into a fishing expedition, the one sentence that keeps the stop focused on its original purpose, and why experienced drivers handle this moment very differently than everyone else. Let's get into it. The trap starts when the original reason for the stop begins to fade into the background. The officer already has your license, already has your registration, already knows why you were pulled over, but now the questions start expanding. Where are you headed? What were you doing tonight? Is this your vehicle? Who are you meeting? How long were you there? Most people think they're just making conversation, so they answer, and answer, and answer some more. Officer, where are you coming from? Driver, just left my friend's house. Officer, which friend? Driver, my buddy Mike. Officer, where does Mike live? Driver, across town. Officer, what were you doing there? Driver, watching the game. Officer, what game? Driver, the championship game. Officer, how long were you there? Now think about what just happened. The stop started with a traffic violation, but now the officer has collected 6 separate statements, and every new statement creates opportunities for inconsistencies, misunderstandings, nervous answers, and follow-up investigations. Most people don't fail because they're guilty of anything else. They fail because they think talking more helps them get out faster. In reality, talking more often gives the encounter more places to go. So why do officers ask these questions? The answer is simple. Officers are trained to gather information. Part of that process involves observing behavior, comparing answers, and determining whether anything else might be going on beyond the original violation. They're looking for indicators. Does the story make sense? Does the driver appear evasive? Do the answers change? Does anything create reasonable suspicion that justifies further investigation? That's why these questions matter. They're not necessarily about the destination. They're about the response. And that brings us to the most important moment of the entire stop, the decision point. This is where the stop either stays focused on its original purpose or starts expanding. The officer asks, "Where are you coming from?" Most drivers think they have only one option: answer the question. But that's exactly where the stop can begin growing beyond the original reason for the stop. Here's the wrong response. Officer, where are you coming from? Driver, my cousin's house. Officer, where does he live? Driver, north side. Officer, what were you doing there? Driver, having dinner. Officer, what time did you arrive? Driver, around 6. Officer, who else was there? Notice what happened. The stop is no longer about the traffic violation. The officer is now exploring an entirely different line of questioning. The driver voluntarily opened the door. Now let's look at the alternative. Officer, where are you coming from? Driver, I'd like to keep the stop focused on the traffic violation. That's it. No argument, no attitude, no lecture, no accusations. Just one sentence. I'd like to keep the stop focused on the traffic violation. Memorize it, because that's the phrase that identifies the decision point. I'd like to keep the stop focused on the traffic violation. The reason it works is simple. You're not refusing to identify yourself. You're not refusing required documents. You're not escalating. You're simply redirecting the encounter back to its original purpose. And that's exactly where many experienced drivers keep the conversation. Now, let's talk about what usually happens next, because officers rarely stop after one question. You may hear something like, "Officer, it's just a simple question." Your response, "I'd like to keep the stop focused on the traffic violation." "Officer, why don't you want to answer?" Your response, I'd like to keep the stop focused on the traffic violation. Officer, are you hiding something? Your response, I'd like to keep the stop focused on the traffic violation. Notice the pattern. The goal isn't to win an argument. The goal isn't to convince the officer. The goal is consistency. The more explanations you add, the more new topics enter the conversation. The shorter your response, the fewer opportunities exist for expansion. Many drivers make a critical mistake here. They hear pushback and immediately start explaining. Officer, why don't you want to answer? Driver, well, it's not that I don't want to answer, I just heard online that people shouldn't answer questions because sometimes things get misunderstood and I don't want any problems, and now they're right back in the trap. More words, more details, more follow-up questions, more investigation. The strongest position is usually the simplest one. One sentence repeated calmly, no emotion, no hostility, no debate. So what's the legal foundation behind all of this? It's straightforward. A traffic stop has a specific purpose. Courts have repeatedly recognized that officers can conduct tasks related to that purpose, such as checking licenses, registration, warrants, and addressing the traffic violation itself. The key issue is whether the stop remains tied to its lawful mission. That's why many defense attorneys emphasize avoiding unnecessary voluntary statements. Not because talking is illegal, not because officers can't ask questions, but because every additional statement creates additional opportunities for the encounter to expand. The principle is simple. You are generally required to comply with lawful requirements connected to the stop. You do not have to volunteer endless information unrelated to the reason you were stopped. And that's where our decision point lives. Not at the beginning of the stop, not at the end, but at the moment the conversation starts drifting away from the traffic violation. That's the moment most drivers miss. Let's bring everything together. The trap is believing every conversational question helps you leave faster. The decision point occurs when the officer begins asking questions unrelated to the original reason for the stop. Most drivers respond by talking more. The encounter grows, the questioning expands, the stop becomes something much larger than it started. The better approach is simple. The exact phrase is, I'd like to keep the stop focused on the traffic violation. Short, polite, professional, easy to remember, and most importantly, it keeps attention on the reason the stop began in the first place. Because once the conversation starts wandering, the encounter often follows. The smartest drivers aren't the ones who talk the most. They're the ones who recognize the decision point before the officer does.